that's fine. That's okay.
It's all good.
That's your one. You're going now?
Off we go.
Did you hear about the first restaurant to open on the moon?
No, Johnny, I have not heard about the first restaurant that opens on the moon.
They had great food, but no atmosphere.
Oh, dear God. Okay.
Kieran, always good to be with you.
And with you, despite the joke.
Well, no, you see, normally it's I try to catch you saying something or doing something,
Yeah.
and I've been told off that many times that I thought we would just start with a joke this
Well,
time.
I'm glad I have a few fans out there that tell you off on these things.
Well, occasionally.
Occasionally.
Yes, some people try to stick up for you.
Okay, that's nice to know. That's
Yeah,
nice
so,
to know.
Hello to those people who stick up for Kieran, which also leads me to another point that you're still ahead in the numbers in the rank. If we could go on, and we've said this before a number of occasions, when you can go on and see the different stats from our podcast and see who's listened the most and what the most popular episode is. Kieran, you're still in the lead by quite a significant margin.
So folks, get on the podcast thing and listen to Johnny's story and change those stats.
Yeah, I don't think that would make any difference. I think you're always going to be in the lead. You're always the much more sought after.
No, I think it was just because it was the first one.
Well, maybe we have to do a test then at some stage just to see that. We'll delete it and see what happens.
Okay, right to be.
But always good to have our listeners with us and our viewers as well. This
great
series,
viewers, yeah.
We've been recording both on podcast and then also available on YouTube, so you can go on, you can search for the Presbyterian and the Priest, and you'll be able to find us on that.
I think though, to find on the YouTube, don't they have to go to Jonathan Fraser?
They do, but I think if they stick in the Presbyterian and the Priest,
come up
search
as well.
for it, should come up as well.
Right.
Yeah.
So either option.
Either option, it's good. But thank you, Kieran. In this series, we've been going through a number of listeners' questions, trying to find out a little bit more about what interests you. We come up with our own suggestions and ideas and themes for our series, and we even have an next series planning in process, which we're looking forward to. And that's maybe a more theological. We try and do a theological and a more kind of open. And that actually, we'll look forward to that anyway. But we've had some good questions already in this series, and a lot of people sending them in. And today's question, Kieran, is probably more for me than you, and it relates to Presbyterianism, and it's from Ronan, who asks, always enjoy the show, keep up the good work, which is nice. He's always talking about you because everyone enjoys yours. And I assume then he's writing from a Catholic faith tradition when he says, I'm always interested by Presbyterianism and its democratic nature, but does this not cause more hassle and problems than it's worth? So that's Ronan's question for today, and that kind of is our topic. So democracy, and maybe we'll talk a little bit about what democracy is first off, and then how it relates to Presbyterianism specifically. We in the Presbyterian Church, Ronan, and for other listeners, and Kieran, I know we've discussed this on many times, have quite a different setup and form to yourselves in the Catholic Church. And so I am the minister, the teaching elder, and we've mentioned on a number of times, I am referred to as the teaching elder. So I am an elder within the church who is gifted or who is given the place of teaching and leading and pastoring and performing the sacraments that we have within the church.
Purpose.
Yes, we're doing for that purpose. Thank you. You see, you've got the good words. And then we have a group of elders around me who form the leadership of the team. So this Kirk session is made up of elders, and in Garnerville we have both men and women as part of that. They are essentially given the role of the spiritual guidance of the church, but they have been nominated by the people. So in any instance within the church, you're nominated to a position and a role. You don't kind of, you don't get to put yourself forward for that. You get nominated for this role. And maybe if I go a step back, or do you want me to tell you about the various forms and ways that happens?
Tell us, yeah.
Okay.
I'm learning this thing.
Well, no, you've heard this as well. So for me, I've been in Garnerville as the teaching elder, as the minister for 10 years, just passed in June there, June 14 I started. And it was to get that role, to become the teaching elder of Garnerville, it was a bit like Britain's Got Talent. So a role becomes available within a church, a teaching elder role, a minister's role becomes available in a church, and you go through a process like anybody else would in the secular world. So you send in an application, you're asked to come for an interview, And generally that interview will be in front of the elders of the church. They might ask for others to be present, but generally that's in front of the elders of the church. Then if they decide that you're kind of the quality of what they're looking, they'll put you in front of the congregation. So you'll go forward and you'll lead a service on a Sunday morning. You'll stand in front of the congregation and you'll lead and preach and do everything that you do in a service, and then you go away and that's your bit done. Now behind the scenes all the while, there are both the elders and then there is the whole congregation, and they'll get together on a specific evening and vote whether they want you or not. It's a bit like Britain's Got Talent. You it's a yes or a no, and there's no gold buzzer though, however. It's just a straight yes or no, and they vote for the person, whether it's a yes or no for this person, and they have to have 67% of that vote to be elected or nominated in this way. So it is seen as very democratic in that there's no kind of 50-50. If you get one yes and the rest no's, if you get 66%, it's still a no because you didn't get the overall majority as it's set out in our code. And so it is quite a democratic process for those people who are like to take part in it. You do need to be a contributing member to the church. You need to be a member first and foremost and participate in the sacraments of the church, and so take communion. But if you do those things, you essentially have a vote within the church. So it's a very democratic process for choosing a minister. Now also then to choose to become an elder within the church. So if you were a member of our congregation, Ronan, a voting member of our congregation, a specific member of the congregation, and you wanted to become an elder, you would also go through a very democratic voting process. So we would say we want a new elder. We would put everyone's name up on a board that is allowed to become this elder. And this is all kind of part of our code, so this isn't just me making this up. Your name, Ronan, would go up on the board. People would be allowed to vote for you, and you'd have to get a specific number of votes, essentially to represent the congregation in the spiritual decision making of the church. And it's the same for a committee who look after the practical elements, where you have to be voted on to that to be able to speak on behalf or to be able to take decisions in that. Now your question was about, is it not more hassle than it's worth? It depends what day you ask me on.
Well, can I ask you one or two things? So you're the teaching elder in the Kirk session.
Yes.
So decisions of the Kirk session, are they by majority votes as well, and do you have a vote?
They are by majority decision, and no, I don't have a vote unless it's a casting vote, unless it's kind of we're stuck, and then I have a deciding vote on that. But ordinarily, no.
So it's a really democratic structure.
Yeah, very much so.
I just wonder, I mean, one of the things that I've said to you, and I smiled to myself, when you think of the way the Catholic and Reformed churches are in Northern Ireland, and by and large their congregations. So a Protestant congregation, Presbyterian congregation, will be very supportive, say, constitutionally, of Northern Ireland being a monarchy. Whereas the Catholic Church doesn't have those democratic structures, and it is a monarchy. And most of its supporters will be looking for a republic.
Yes.
So there's a little irony there. Yeah.
And then that's for an individual church, and again, you know what you've said, it goes up in the scale as well, in that because we are part of a Presbyterian church, we're not just a congregational church. It's not just our church, we're part of the Presbyterian Church in Ireland. Our church then gets a vote and gets a say in various levels going up, and so in East Belfast there's an East Belfast Presbytery where there are 19 Presbyterian churches I think in East Belfast, and we can decide and we can vote on various aspects of work within our presbytery and what we want to happen, and then those presbyteries form a larger General Assembly where we can all go then as a minister, as a voting member, and various elders can go to and essentially take part in decision making for the whole church.
May I ask you, does that democratic structure go back to John Calvin, to the very beginning?
That's a good question. I imagine the democratic sense does, but the form of it now is very different.
It has evolved. I just wonder, was that choice to go in a very democratic way right from the beginning part of the whole Protestant Reformation and reaction against what was the very monarchical structure of the Catholic Church?
Yes, I think, and we've said this on a number of occasions, where everything that has happened in the Reformed Church is a reaction to what was happening in the Catholic Church of its day.
Yeah.
And so yes, in theory, now when we talk John Calvin back in that time of the Reformation, I don't think it was happening, and there was politics mixed up in it, and the Council of Geneva had a big part to say in what he wasn't allowed to do. But I think yes, the beginnings of it, the seeds of it were there, and have adapted over time. Now we got our governance from the Church of Scotland, which was John Knox back in the day, and so I think the seeds of it were there, and the desire to take the power away from those with most authority and take it down into the pews was the ethos, purpose behind it. Now there are, so for example, every year we elect a moderator for the church, and that's done by vote. So each presbytery gets to vote on that, and we as members within presbytery get to vote on that. So there are all kinds of levels, and there are all ways, and it's very democratic. And Ronan, you asked the question, and that in itself, I read an interesting book by John Dunlop, a former Presbyterian moderator, who said that born in the identity of the Presbyterian is not a contempt for, but a suspicion of any kind of authority, which I thought was interesting, because all of it is based on democracy, and all of it will be centralized in some way, and a bit like we see like the elections in America and in times gone by, there is always suspicion born into and out of democracy, and so there are pros to it, and everyone has a valuable part to play in it, and everyone has a vote, and your vote can make a difference, and you can as a community decide on things that you want to do. It also means that you can't have a minister who can essentially just do what he wants or she wants. You have a democratic process to enable you as a group, as a congregation, in some ways to steer and help that minister, that teaching elder, in what they do and what you do as a church. There are also downsides in it, because like in every democracy, sometimes the people who shout the loudest
get their way.
Yeah, getting their way anyway, and although it's not authoritarian, sometimes it can be the case. We in Garden at the minute, we have 11, 12 elders, male and female. I know of churches that have upwards of 40 elders, and actually say it's easier, because no one particular voice can hold sway over the others, or can hold a sense of power or authority over the others, and everything's done in the majority, and so no small factions can influence that. And in some ways you can see that the bigger the democracy gets, the bigger the people participating in it get, the truer it should become. And so there are joys in it, and there are also sorrows in it at times when you don't get what you want.
Okay, it's very different. The Catholic Church is hierarchical, and the Protestant Reformation absolutely rejected that kind of structure. Now, I'm a little bit out of my theological depth here, but I do think that hierarchical structure goes back to an understanding of Jesus, and that from his disciples he chose 12, the apostles, and that the bishops in the church are the successors to the apostles. So governance in the Catholic Church is in the hands of the ordained. Yeah. So that would be, mainly the bishops. Like the ordained would be the deacons, the priests and the bishops, but it's essentially the bishops are the successors of the apostles. So they're the ones who are tasked with governance. And of course, since in the Catholic Church there's no ordination of women, it immediately means this is governance by men only. And the Bishop of Rome is supposed to be, the Latin tag is primus inter pares, that he's first among equals. But essentially he has a level of authority greater than the bishops.
And are there any ways then in which there's so for example, when he is elected, how does that happen?
Well, that is by a kind of a democratic process. In this regard, the Pope can choose his helpers, and originally they were to help the Bishop of Rome in the Diocese of Rome, but they have now become the College of Cardinals. Okay. So the Pope decides who he wants to be a cardinal, and that's an absolute choice on his part. And then from the College of Cardinals, anyone under 80 is a voting member when it comes to electing a pope.
Okay.
So there's a thing called the College of Cardinals, a thing called the Conclave, where those cardinals are locked into the Vatican somewhere, and they have to stay there until they have elected a successor.
Smoke comes
Till
out.
the smoke comes out. But it's interesting with the way democracy goes. The election of Donald Trump, you won't really expect to hear it, but the election of Donald Trump goes back to this whole College of Cardinals thing.
Right.
Because when the founding fathers were establishing the US Constitution and the way they would have a president, they chose to go this way, to have a college, an electoral college.
Okay.
So the people of America don't actually elect the President of the United States. They elect representatives to a college, and that college then elects the President. So Donald Trump won because he got the most potential voters in this college. And they will meet, I think, sometime in December to actually formally elect the president. So it's a kind of a democracy, but it's not as absolutely democratic as you. But then, no, but if you think then of kind of elections, we're doing this on the eve of a general election in the Republic. People don't actually get to choose the government. They get to choose who goes to Parliament, and then the politicians choose a government, and then one party chooses a prime minister.
Yeah.
So it's indirect democracy.
Yeah. And in some ways that transfers across, and I mentioned that's essentially how we choose our moderator.
Yeah.
In that same way, we don't specifically vote for him, but we gather as in some way kind of an electoral group to put forward someone to represent, and then it's kind of decided through us all. So it's not an individual. Like there's a kind of similarity in there.
And see, so then when it comes to say in the local church in the Catholic world, the people of an area do not get a choice in who becomes their bishop.
Okay.
So they have no choice in that. That is all done at another level. There is a consultation of the priests of the diocese and maybe some of the religious of the diocese, and they're asked to suggest names, and then the papal nuncio, the representative of the Holy See to whatever country, will send names to Rome, and from those names somebody will be chosen. Now, there are one or two places in the world, I believe, but maybe the listeners can point out the error of my ways when I say that. I think in Switzerland there is one diocese where historically the people have always chosen the bishop.
Okay.
And I think there was some effort some years ago to push back on that and take that away, but it hasn't happened.
Okay, well,
so generally, no. So the ordinary people don't.
What happens then in more recent times, where you have had, I can't remember the name of it, but last year before, you were trying to include the laity?
A synod. Yeah, Pope Francis has advocated this synodality, where you have the laity involved. So he's had two sessions where from each country elected people and sent them to Rome to talk about all the issues that needed to be talked about. Now, Pope Francis has his critics on the right wing of the Catholic Church, and they were arguing that this is not a legitimate way to proceed, etc., etc. You've got such terrible things as men and women who are not ordained voting, particularly women voting. My goodness, how could that be? I'm being a bit smart here now. But they will criticise the synodality approach. But excuse me, but the idea is to try and move it into, not exactly a democratic structure, but into one where more voices are heard in trying to define where we go than just the voices of those in governance.
So it's not necessarily including them in democratic decision making, but it's more listening to the voice of the lay people in that way. Interesting. And I imagine, when we were preparing for this, I gave you the Churchill quote that says democracy is the worst form of government apart from all the others. So there is a sense in which we could both see pros and cons. I can in some ways see the positives for yours, the negatives, and in the same way, I'm sure you can reflect on mine and what.
But even redemptive religious life has a form of democracy, but it's not absolute. So, for instance, the community will the rector of the house, the superior of the house, is chosen by the provincial and his council, but after consulting with the community.
Okay.
That doesn't mean the community always gets the person who they want, but he will consult. So then a rector is appointed, so that the community doesn't choose or elect a rector.
Okay.
But the community does choose 2 members or others to be his consultors. So they are chosen democratically by the community. But once that leadership team, say in Clonard, there are 3 of us now in the leadership team, once that leadership team is in place, that basically is the executive. So the community might talk about a particular issue and bring up its concerns, but the community doesn't get to decide how that is resolved. It's done by the leadership team. Now, a leadership team would be very foolish not to stay in communication with the community and explain a decision, but it can happen that a leadership team takes decisions that are not exactly in line with what the community might have thought. So there's that little deficit there in the democratic structure. And then even then, the leadership team in a community, if it takes a certain kind of decision, may have to pass that decision up to the next level, which is our provincial, and his council will decide as to whether this decision is happening or not.
You may have taken a vow of celibacy, but it sounds like you live in any other married household where there are certain levels of decision making, and some go just above your pay grades. You know, some of us in a home can decide things or think that we decide things, but it has to pass through various levels of governance before you're either listened to or get another say in any of it.
Naomi, I hope you're listening to this.
Well, yeah, my decision making is down to the dog anyway, so we'll see. But it also reminded me in that kind of sense of not just religious life, but communal living. There's always democracy. You know, you were saying there as that group, I was joking about married life. You know, even in the WhatsApp groups we have, if you're trying to make a decision or about where you're going to go or what you're going to do, there's always a democratic process in all aspects of life, whether you realise it or not, for the kind of the communal good, if you want to put it that way, or for the common life. There's always decision making, and there's always characters involved. There's always people and the tensions involved in that. And so democracy is part of our lives, religious, political, social, all of
at least in this part of the world. Of course, what's playing out in Ukraine and maybe across the world altogether is kind of a standoff between the democracies and the autocratic countries. And I mean, Vladimir Putin is saying that there's a new world order emerging, and it won't involve the West, it'll be Russia and China, which are not democracies in our sense of the word. Whereas the Western democracies, Putin is saying, are going to fail. But this has always been around. This has been around since the beginning of the 19th century, going into World War I and then into World War II and the Cold War and all of that. This standoff between 2 very different styles of governance in our world. And it would seem that people in the autocratic ones, I'm just back to Churchill's comment, it might be the best, but the alternatives are far worse.
Yeah, I was listening to another podcast in advance of this, just trying to think about the wider sense of democracy, and the guy who was on it, I can't remember his name actually, he said that when it comes to democracy, we have choices in life and in a common life, and he said there's a kill them, coerce them, persecute them, or do politics. And in some ways that's that autocratic, that's what we're seeing in the world around us, isn't it? It's the if you can't agree with someone or get someone to meet you in that sense of choice, you either kill them, you coerce them, try and give them something in exchange, or put the price of oil up, or put the price of food up so that you can leverage them in some way. You persecute them, or you do politics and you try to come to some kind of democratic solution.
Isn't that a summary really of where we've come to in Northern Ireland? That we've come to a point where we have to do politics and talk to one another after all of the other stuff that went on for 30 years.
Which is a democratic process in itself, which doesn't necessarily get the outcomes that we might like at all times, but is for that common good. One of the things I'll go way off piste here, one of the things that I've always wondered about and would like to look into a little bit more is how to I'm not sure happily is the word, but how to live well as a minority. And there are lots of minorities within our culture at the minute. And how do you live well and happily being a minority in a culture around you that may be different to you? You know, how do you do that without trying to kill, coerce, or persecute?
That's a very interesting question, because I've often thought to myself, would the Catholic Church in Ireland have been in a different place, in a different kind of church, if it had been a minority and not a majority? A lot of the things that are associated with the church in terms of bad things that were done really arose out of the fact that it was a majority, at least in south of the border. I don't know what it was like, because I didn't live here during that time, what it was like for people who were part of a minority here. But like English Catholics, and they have their very long and convoluted history, but they have been a minority always since the 16th century. And I wonder, have they done better than ourselves? I don't know the answer to that question, but I wonder what it is like to live as a minority. I lived for a little while in Denmark, where the Catholic population is 0.5% of the population. But it's probably not a good metric, because Denmark, while it is confessionally a Lutheran state, it's totally secular, so people didn't really care what religion you were.
It certainly would be interesting if you could, do the imaginative test and think about what this country would have been like if our minorities had not only lived well, but also been graciously allowed to live well. Because we think of all that's happened here in this country was a minority group that essentially was coerced and persecuted and killed. The politics wasn't done.
No.
And that's going to be the problem going forward, in that a majority group who now is becoming a minority group doesn't know how to live well in a society as a minority group, so will kill, coerce, and persecute. And it's that sense of, how do we as people within democracy learn to live well even when we are a minority group? And we see it, I see it in churches, and that's one of the cons of democracy in any social setting or any church setting. There are always people who aren't happy with the decision. There are always people who are fighting against the decision. There are always people who essentially don't get what they want. And so it's how do you live well? How do you?
But maybe both our churches are becoming minorities. I mean, one of the things you've said to me a number of times is that the Presbyterian Church now is very concerned, as I suppose the others are, with secularization, and that society has become so very secularized. And if you take the number in our churches who would be committed disciples of Jesus, that's a small percentage now. So in terms of committed Christian disciples in whatever Christian denomination, I think we're fast becoming minorities in a very secularized island, north and south.
It leads us into the bigger challenge then of, regardless of our voting structures, but in wider society, how do we graciously show that discipleship? How do we graciously show the kingdom of God in the midst of democratic living?
But see, for me, therein lies a problem. I don't know if we've got to a point where our committed disciples of Jesus exercise political choice on the basis of being a committed disciple of Jesus. I still think that people identify, as is their right, with political parties, and when voting comes, it's a them and us thing all the time. Even though these will be really good people, of course they're good people, and they are committed followers of Jesus. But when it comes to the politics still is very persuasive.
Isn't it? And even isn't that the way in human nature?
Absolutely.
I'm sure you see it in your community, I see it in my community and churches, in that, yes, there are always those pockets of people who will gather the them and us mentality, and maybe we're the opportunity to see that there can be something more than that.
Yeah, you would hope, but I think as life moves on, for the sake of good living on this island, north and south, I think more a spirit of generosity. But of course, there are also issues around trust and trying to. I mean, the wounds of what history has done to us. Those wounds are deep and painful, and they're healing only slowly. It will take time. It will take time.
You've set us off on a very different path there, Roland. We started off talking about democracy within the Presbyterian Church. We've gone a long way from that, and let me just say that yes, that there is a sense of democracy in it, and there is a sense of democracy in all that we seek to do, even within the Catholic Church that you mentioned there, and so hopefully you'll have learned a little bit of a sense of that, and you'll see your own part in that. Kieran, it's been a joy.
Yeah, thank you. It's been lovely, and I know we have one more to do in this series.
We do, and that will be a kind of sum up. It will be a brief encounter of us talking about what aspects we like, or what questions we like, or what we learned.
Or what we learned, and maybe a little Christmas message in there as well.
Will we vote? Will we vote on it?
I think we have
a third party.
What?
Only the third party. You, our listener, can be the third party, so let us know at
presbyterianpriest@gmail.com.
Which was your favourite question, or even if you still have questions. I know people have been in touch with me with kind of follow-on questions about various of the topics, so please feel free to do that.
Please do.
And continue the conversation, and we'll see where we end up. And thanks for those who watch along with us. That's another way in which I've discovered some people don't get the podcast or don't like getting podcasts, so
they're going
like to watch along. So
excellent.
You get to see our beautiful faces this afternoon. But every grace and peace to you.
Grace and peace. Thank you.
Did you wave? It's like the end of Clonard.
The end of Clonard, yeah. The Clonard wave. That was interesting.
Was.
Where it went.